Resuming debate, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Canadian Heritage.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to speak on Budget 2017. I want to address key parts of Budget 2017 that I know will have an important and lasting impact on my riding of Parkdale High Park in Toronto. Since October of 2015, Mr. Speaker, I've heard loud and clear from my constituents about the issues that matter to them the most, and I know that this budget will go a long way to addressing those very issues. So first, I want to start with housing, Mr. Speaker. I want to discuss our government's historical investment and plan to address affordable housing. Mr. Speaker, one of the most important issues to residents of my riding is access to housing. Since being elected, I've heard about housing when canvassing at the doors of my constituents, in meetings at my office, during visits to various co-ops in Parkdale High Park, and I have 5 such entities, Mr. Speaker: Dufferin Grove, Swansea Village, Howard Park Co-op, Spencer Avenue, and the John Bruce Village. In meetings with the Canadian Housing and Renewal Association and the Cooperative Housing Federation of Canada, I've also heard about the important needs for housing, in particular the critical need to ensure affordable housing stock in our cities. On March 29th of last week, Mr. Speaker, I held a standing room only town hall in my riding of Parkdale High Park on this very issue, and I heard then firsthand from residents of my riding about the importance of our government resolving the affordable housing issue and working with local partners like the Parkdale Neighbourhood Land Trust to make that happen. Mr. Speaker, I've heard these concerned citizens in my community, and I've responded by advocating, together with members of our Toronto caucus and Ontario caucus, loudly and frequently and with passion that we must get housing right. And why, Mr. Speaker? Because housing is foundational. What I mean by that, Mr. Speaker, is that if we address Canadians' housing needs, our residents will have better health, better educational, and better economic outcomes. I'm proud to say that advocacy on behalf of my constituents has produced results, Mr. Speaker. What am I referring to? I'm referring to Budget 2017 and the historic investment of $11 billion this year alone to housing. On top of the base funding of $4 billion, Mr. Speaker, that brings the total to $15 billion that our government has committed over the past 2 years alone to the much-needed national housing strategy. What does this mean, Mr. Speaker? It means access to more affordable housing for residents in Parkdale High Park. The $15 billion will include some of the following investments. $5 billion, Mr. Speaker, to the National Housing Fund to address critical housing issues and prioritize support for vulnerable citizens. And this is important, Mr. Speaker, because the priority will be on seniors, Indigenous persons, survivors fleeing situations of domestic violence, persons with disabilities, and those dealing with mental health and addiction issues, as well as veterans. Mr. Speaker, $3.2 billion is also dedicated to a renewal of federal and provincial partnership on affordable housing. $2.1 billion is dedicated to expanding and extending the homeless partnering strategy. And $202 million, Mr. Speaker, is dedicated to make federal lands available for affordable housing developments. Mr. Speaker, the next thing I want to discuss in terms of Budget 2017 is its impact on families and childcare. I'm a husband and a father of 2 young children, Mr. Speaker. My riding of Parkdale High Park is home to countless families just like mine. These families have reached out to me to laud our government for taking as one of our very first actions measures to cut taxes on Canada's middle class. They've also welcomed the Canada Child Benefit, a once-in-a-generation type of change, Mr. Speaker, that targets tax-free benefits to those raising kids who need the help the most on a proportional scale. Mr. Speaker, for those raising children in my community and in communities around the country, our 2016 budget provided an initial $500 million for early learning and childcare. But building on this, Budget 2017 will invest an additional $7 billion, Mr. Speaker, to support the creation of high-quality childcare spaces across Canada. This means up to 40,000 new subsidized childcare spaces in this country. I know what this means for my riding of Parkdale High Park. Mr. Speaker, it means more options for parents who are literally fed up with signing up on literally dozens of childcare waiting lists the moment they conceive a child, Mr. Speaker. That is what it has come to in my riding and in ridings around this country. What this budget means and what this investment means is more supply of much-needed daycare spots, that more parents will be able to return to work and return to work sooner. This unprecedented investment will address both the supply of spaces and help drive down costs by boosting the amount of subsidized spots. But Budget 2017 does more for families raising kids, Mr. Speaker. We've also fulfilled our campaign commitment to introduce more flexibility and provide greater choice to parents on parental leave. These proposed changes will allow parents to choose to receive their current benefits over an extended period of up to 18 months, allowing them to spend more time with their kids in their early tender years. Mr. Speaker, third area, I want to talk about women and gender parity. The impact of this budget on women is profound. Budget 2017 was the first budget ever in Canada's history where the budget included a gender statement. This statement shows the impact of programs across government lines on women. It reflects directly, in a clear and tangible manner, our commitment on the part of this side of the House to ensuring that the goal of gender equality permeates every single thing we do as a federal government. On top of our historic childcare investment, women deserve to feel safe, supported and protected in our communities. I was proud to see $100.9 million allocated in Budget 2017 to establish a national strategy to address gender-based violence. Mr. Speaker, in the past, I've been involved in my riding with a shelter called the Redwood. That's a shelter for women and children fleeing domestic violence. In my involvement with the Redwood, I've seen the amazing work being done in my community, but I've also seen firsthand the critical need for investment and resources to end gender-based violence. Budget 2017 is a start in terms of moving towards that important goal. Budget 2017 also dedicates critical funding for women abroad. I'm doubly proud that our government has endorsed the Dutch initiative, Mr. Speaker, and we will be dedicating $650 million in international aid to the education of women and girls and to empower women to maintain control over their reproductive rights. This aid, particularly at this point in time globally, Mr. Speaker, is critical. Mr. Speaker, fourth, I want to address this budget in terms of its impact on Indigenous persons. This budget serves the important objective of reconciliation, a goal for this government, a goal for my constituents in Parkdale High Park. It builds on the significant investments in Budget 2016 of over $8 billion to Indigenous persons. Budget 2017 continues our important work in making commitments to First Nations, Inuit and Métis people that demonstrate a new nation-to-nation relationship. So what does this budget do, Mr. Speaker? Budget 2017 commits to establishing a new fiscal relationship that lifts the 2% cap on annual funding increases. Budget 2017 provides $225 million to provide access to affordable and culturally appropriate housing for Indigenous peoples living off reserve. Budget 2017 dedicates $300 million to the construction of housing in Canada's north. $225 million on top of that is dedicated in this budget to housing providers for Indigenous persons not living on reserves. We've also dedicated $828 million for improving health for our First Nation and Inuit persons, including $305 million for the non-insured health benefits program. Mr. Speaker, we have also, over the last year, lifted 18 long-term drinking water advisories in First Nations communities, and we are on track to eliminate all such advisories by March 2021. We are investing $4 billion, Mr. Speaker, to improve housing, water treatment systems, and healthcare facilities and community infrastructure in partnership with First Nations and Inuit. And very importantly, Mr. Speaker, the mental health services for First Nations and Inuit are getting an injection of $204 million to improve mental health, $118 million for mental health programming, and $86 million for the non-insured health benefits program. Mr. Speaker, in my remaining time, I want to underscore the important initiatives that help the most vulnerable in this budget. I'm most proud about these provisions. And who am I talking about, Mr. Speaker? Low-income families. We are dedicating $13 million to have affordable access to the internet for low-income families. Refugees, Mr. Speaker. I served as a parliamentary secretary for immigration. I was very proud to do so. I hear constantly from my constituents about their concerns about an open and compassionate and welcoming system, but one that is fair and accessible for all. We're improving that access, Mr. Speaker, by dedicating $62 million to legal aid for asylum seekers. This budget doubles the amount of funds in the security infrastructure program, Mr. Speaker. It serves those people who are victims of hatred. In rising times of division and a climate of hatred and bigotry, Mr. Speaker, our government is committing in terms of hard dollars to protect those who want safety when they are worshiping. This budget will also protect newcomers, Mr. Speaker, in terms of their integration by dedicating $27 million to foreign credential recognition. Why am I standing here, Mr. Speaker? Because this budget addresses housing, it addresses Indigenous persons, women and families, and vulnerable Canadians. I'm proud to represent the residents of Parkdale High Park in supporting this budget, and I urge all members of this House to do the same. Merci beaucoup.
Well done.
Question.